Today, my guest is Professor April Knill. I'll keep my introduction short to maximize our time with her. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about April as a person, Professor Knill as a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and finally as a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I'll skip many of her accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. Professor Knill is the Vice President of Programs for the Eastern Finance Association. She is ranked in top 10% of SSRN authors for all-time downloads and for downloads in the last 12 months, and top 10 list for multiple papers. She was nominated for Best Paper Awards at AIB Southeast Conference and Financial Management Association Conference. April is a consulting editor at JIBS and an associate editor at Global Finance Journal. She was a guest editor for 2 special issues at Journal of Corporate Finance and JIBS. April worked as a consultant for the Development Research Group at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. Thank you, April, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
April, what did you want to become when you were a child?
Actually, believe it or not, I started out wanting to be an elementary education teacher and went through all the coursework that was required for that degree. And as I was going along, one day, one of my professors was like talking about how little teachers make, in K through 12 education, and saying you really need to make sure that you invest some money. And that day he introduced me to the idea of compound interest. And I remember that day vividly. I fell in love with finance, and that was all she wrote. So I just decided and I did student teaching, and I realized that I didn't want to teach 2 + 2 for the rest of my life. No offense to those teachers that do and are fulfilled by it, but I just knew it wasn't going to work for me. So I combined the love of finance with teaching older kids, and that's how I decided to become a professor. And that was, once I knew that, it was easy.
And where did you grow up?
In Maryland.
Okay.
Yeah.
And about IB or international, can you remember the first moment of awareness between domestic versus foreign?
Yeah. So, it might have been before this memory, but I was thinking about this before. So when I was in high school, my choir instructor was, I guess, plugged into the international scene. So she organized 2 things. The first was she had choirs and bands come from schools in different countries. And so one particular band was from Germany. And, she would have us host the band members, some of the families. And that was a wonderful experience. It was really impactful. I remember it vividly, even today. And then she organized a trip to London, Wales with our choir. And so we went there and we performed a bunch of concerts, and we stayed with host families. And it was, again, very impactful, just to, sort of learn about different cultures and different countries, and just be aware that there's a lot more than what you are familiar with in your little part of the world.
Interesting. And something that is not on your CV that people might find interesting?
As it relates to my job, I think something that most people don't know about me is I'm a bit of a news junkie. I'm constantly reading and sort of tapping into different news sources, and just very, very, very interested in all things current events.
How long do you spend a day on reading news and reports?
Most of my waking hours, besides my research, but it all kind of goes together. Current events and news and what's going on, that just sort of sets my research interest on fire. And I try to think about what things are relevant. My sort of barometer for what's a good idea is, could I explain it to my parents who are not finance academics? Could I explain it to them? And would they think it's interesting? And would they think it matters? Would they think it's worth my time to look into? And so that's my sort of rule of thumb. It hasn't, led me astray yet.
Okay. Well, if you stop doing what you're doing today, what's the second best career path for you?
I know how this is going to sound, but honestly, I can't see any other career for me. I tell people all the time, I have the best job in the world. I love what I do. It's like the old expression goes, if you do what you love, you never work another day of your life. And it is honestly, I don't see me ever retiring. So fair warning to Florida State. I don't. There's no reason for me to retire. It gives me purpose. It satisfies curiosity. So if you force me to make a decision, I would say something in research, but a university professor is just, it fits me like a glove. This is what I was meant to be. I know it.
Interesting. About regrets, have you got any regrets?
I do. I'm pretty proud of how far I've come, but if I had to do it all over again, I would make some changes. I think when I first graduated, I actually had an A publication while I was still a student. And I had, I think, a false impression of how easy it was to publish. And I didn't see how important it is to be affiliated with some very well-established people in your discipline. I think it matters a lot more than that young scholar was aware. So that's probably a good way to put it in a nutshell.
What did you learn from your biggest mistake?
That was probably
That was it.
in my career. That was probably it. So I started, aligning myself with some of those more well-established scholars. And I think it takes a while, especially if you don't hit 5 home runs coming out of the gate. But, I've built on my successes and, hopefully get bigger and bigger and bigger. And I'm still working on it. I mean, it's a never-ending journey for me, but in a happy way. It's not a sort of tortured thing. It's the more successes I get, the more I want, and just lets me reach to that next higher goal.
What are you most passionate about?
Research.
Was it?
Just working on things that matter. I mean, the idea in academia that we can potentially make an impact on the world. We can potentially sort of unearth things that have never really been thought of or tested or dreamed about, or dare we dream make the world a better place in some tiny way. I mean, it's kind of invigorating to think that you can actually leave your mark on the world forever. It's a wonderful idea. So that's what I'm passionate about. I think trying to solve some of the problems or concerns that exist.
Thank you. April, you mentioned you wanted to explain your research to your parents and you were successful. I wasn't. So let's say you're stranded in a small village. So there are locals, they don't read your work regularly. And there are also my parents there. How do you explain your research to people who don't read academic work? And why is your research important?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of my ideas, as I alluded to before, are sort of born out of current events or the situations that are going on. And so I think automatically, now assuming these people have access to current events, if they don't, then I may not be able to explain it to them. But I have talked to total strangers about my research because like I typically look at the intersection between law and finance and politics. And so any of the current events that are, in that nexus, usually people are going to be aware of. And, I try to answer things in a sort of apolitical, neutral way, but things that most people are actually interested in. So it's usually something that I try to build on, the explanation I try to build on based on what I think they're familiar with. But in general, it's like what I said, the intersection between law, finance, and politics is probably my sort of passion. And a lot of that actually is in an international setting, which is why I'm talking to you.
April, let's say a PhD student comes to you and says, I'm thinking about writing a dissertation, but I'm having difficulty finding interesting ideas. Can you give a couple of ideas for students who are going to be writing on these intersection points? What are the next big questions, in your opinion, for the field?
Well, I mean, I see a lot of things happening around the world. I think the political climate is changing around the world. I think the cultural climate is changing around the world. I think there's a shift toward protectionism and against, away from globalism. And all of those things have impacts on a lot of the things that have been looked at in the past. Additionally, COVID, I mean, there are papers popping up every single day. I'm writing 2 papers on COVID, but there are any number of papers that could pop up from that. I mean, we are re-examining, my co-authors and I are re-examining whether globalization for a multinational corporation is purely a positive thing, or whether there are some limitations, liabilities, if you will, of the idea. And COVID has actually unearthed some of those potential limitations, when you're thinking about a multinational corporation versus a domestic only corporation. I think most people think that that is a purely positive thing. Well, COVID has unearthed the idea that, with regard to supply chain, for example, it can be a limitation, it can be a problem. You have lots of technology things popping up. You have the colonial pipeline thing that happened. You've got hacking. So any of those sort of current events. I tell my PhD students, become a news junkie. Read the Wall Street Journal every single day. Read, reputable sources, not, politically biased ones that will, keep you up to date on what's going on around the world. And then ask yourself, which of these, if any, are, something that I can test in an empirical setting, something that might be worthwhile pursuing, something that is new. COVID obviously was excellent there, because the last pandemic we had was the Spanish flu, right? So, I mean, these things just, they're sort of organic. They just pop up, and you just have to be paying attention.
Mm-hmm. And about investments, Chinese investments, Indian investments in Africa. What is your prediction? What is your foresight on how that infrastructure initiative is going to be taking shape in the future?
I think it's interesting, and I think it has the potential to change world order, depending on how things, sort of pan out there. I think it's something that the United States should be paying attention to, and thinking about, and, planning for, and sort of getting in the game as well. So, I think it's too early to tell, but I think it's something that could have a major impact.
April, I asked this question to a couple of people before. I want to ask you the same thing about the modern monetary theory or the modern economic theory. There's not even a real name for it yet, but basic logic is governments who can print money, and they don't have to go into any kind of bankruptcy as long as they keep printing money. So they flood the markets with cash. Is this a sustainable model?
No.
So what's going to happen? I'm really curious about what's the future?
I mean, that's a really good question. I don't know that I can predict what the future will bring, but I think, cryptocurrency is a game changer. I mean, I'm personally not somebody that is jumping to invest in it, but I tend to be a little cautious. But I know a lot of my colleagues that have, as far as the printing of money, I mean, that just leads to inflation. And if you have hyperinflation, Argentina back in the early 2000s had hyperinflation. I mean, that leads to a currency crisis, and that causes all kinds of economic problems. So any country that's going to try to do that, it's going to lead to economic pain for sure. I've heard lots of, my mother actually asked me about, are we going to have one currency globally? I don't foresee that happening. I just don't, not in our lifetime anyway. I think the experiment that is the euro teaches us a lot of things. And, I tell my students every semester, I teach international, in the beginning, there was a honeymoon period. Everything was hunky-dory. All the economies were kind of on the same plane. You had to be in the beginning, you had to get sort of that, the physical from the economic doctor and make sure that, there's no sort of major problems brewing. You're all on the same level as far as, your economic stability, et cetera. And so everything was wonderful. But then, actually, the US sort of had a role to play there. We had the global recession. We started the global recession, and, we started to see some economic pains in Europe. And when you have individual countries like Greece that fall into crisis, but other countries like Germany that were in great shape, what do? You've got one monetary policy because you've got one currency. So what do? A country like the United States, when we have a problem, the Fed responds by either, if you have, the economy is floundering, you can reduce interest rates to the extent that there's room to do so. And if you are having signs of inflation, typically they'll raise the interest rates. Well, we're one currency, one country. So we have the freedom to do that. When you have, a group of countries that have one currency, like with the Eurozone, then if you have one country that's in trouble, then you have the situation where Germany had to bail out Greece, and it becomes an issue, and it's an ongoing thing. As long as everybody's on the same page with their economic status, you're fine. There's no problem. But the minute you're not, you got big problems because there's not a lot you can do. You got fiscal policy and monetary policy. Well, monetary policy is not your own anymore when you agree to that situation. And fiscal policy is taxation and government spending. There's only so much you can do with that. And it's really unpopular if you want to raise taxes on everyone. So it's a tough situation. And you've already had one country that exited, right? So I think we should learn from that. Whether we do or not is a different question, but I think we should learn from that. I think there are some countries that maybe wish, unofficially, that they hadn't signed on to that because it's causing some issues that they didn't foresee, or it's a little more painful than they thought it would be in, sort of the rough times. And if we were to go to a one currency system, that's where we would land eventually at some point. And so I personally think that is not a place that we should strive to be.
Thank you. April, about mentoring and advice, is there one thing that you wish you had known when you were starting out, which would save so much time, pain, and agony, and start you off in you actually had an AA publication, but is there something that they should know at the early times in their program?
Yeah, so I think I'll go back to one of the things I said before, and that is make sure that you network. I think networking is possibly the most important thing that you need to do. Maybe not the most, but it's up there for sure in the top 5, definitely. And it's painful at first because you don't know anybody. Except for the true extroverts, they probably don't care. But the rest of us that aren't truly extroverted, it's a little painful at first, but it gets better. And, I think you should, I tell my students all the time, you want to shoot for at least 3 papers completely finished out of the gate, because you are going to find that the time is extremely short between graduation and when you have to put your notebook in for tenure. So the more you can get done before you graduate, the better. I also tell my students, you want to try to go to a place that is set up to help you with your research goals. But, all that said, being, more true to who I am as an advisor, I'm advising a student right now that's going to be on the market soon. And I had a conversation with him, basically saying, look, you are in this program to have choices, to be able to choose a place to work where you're going to be happy. And in the end, that's what matters. It's, for some people, research is not their jam, it's not what brings them joy. And if that doesn't bring them joy, they shouldn't go to a place where that is the most important thing. They got to find their fit. It's a fit both ways. It's not just a fit for the university that's hiring them. It's a fit for the person too, because you're going to spend, I've been here at Florida State for 16 years. So, it's important that you find a fit. But yeah, I think they just need to be true to themselves, figure out what is important to them, and try to stay true to that in the job market to the extent that they can. That's probably.
So, April, about the common mistakes that you see PhD students or junior faculty make. First, they don't know what they want. They don't really, or they ended up in a place that they are not going to be comfortable in. That's number one. What other common mistakes do you know? Can you name?
Maybe underestimating how quickly the time will pass. I've seen that a couple of times where the way we describe it is, a fire underneath them. Hopefully the annual evaluations do that. And I'm speaking of assistant professors. But if they get themselves in trouble, it's because they probably don't, I imagine, they don't think that it's as urgent as it really is. From day one, they need to be going to conferences. They need to be marketing their research. They need to be sending their paper out to colleagues for comments. They need to be, trying to work with people they know to set up brown bags or seminars. Get that paper presented as many times as you can. What I've heard is the rule of thumb is 10 presentations. And I think it's a pretty good rule of thumb, wherever it is, whether it's a seminar, a conference, a brown bag. Get comments from colleagues, you just send it out via email, get those comments, get the paper vetted so you can be ready to submit it to journals, because the journal process is really long and arduous, and you have to get used to a lot of rejections. Those of us that have been, in the field for a decade or more, one of my mentors actually told me once he could wallpaper his wall with rejections, and he's a really successful guy. So that's why I remember it, because it struck me. I was like, really? Yeah, you have to get thick skin in a hurry.
Who was your advisor?
Well, this was a mentor. It was not my advisor, but is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
The person that was Doug Cumming.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, that was struck me because he's, oh my gosh, I don't even know how many publications he has, but very successful guy. And I was like, really? Oh yeah, we all get them.
Didn't you write the book on how to publish, how to write these?
Maybe the book was built on the rejections, Joe.
What's the best advice you received when you were going through the program that really made a huge difference in your life? It can be about anything, really.
Wow, that's a tough one. I do remember this was early on. There was someone that told me that getting tenure is like rushing for a sorority or a fraternity. in that things were really squishy. They're very subjective, and I think that was good advice because it brought to mind, it brought it to the forefront that you have to connect with these people and show them that you are going to be a good colleague even after tenure. And now that I'm on the other side of it, on P&T committees, I see what they mean now, because there are sometimes, for most people not so much, but for some people there are questions. Are they going to just sort of disappear after they get tenure? And you want to know that they're going to contribute. And so you have to, in my department, it meant going to lunch a lot of days. And that is during crunch time, right? I just finished saying that there's this urgency. You got to publish, you got to get all this work done. At the same time, you have to show up. You have to have the FaceTime. You have to interact with the department chair and, definitely know who your P&T committee members are, and make sure you get to know them. Make sure you let them know that you are there every day. You're working hard. You're, sending your stuff out to conferences, to, colleagues. You're getting it done. You're working hard. And that means a lot, because it is, in the end, it is squishy. At most universities, some universities probably do have some, sort of hard standards, and they have less flexibility, but most schools that I'm aware of, it's pretty squishy. They can put through people that they think would be good colleagues going forward. And, alternatively, I know a situation where the person had the publications to get tenure, but they didn't get tenure because they never showed up to anything. So it cuts both ways. There's lots of things that are important. So it's not just research.
Thank you. April, for the sake of time, what's the question that I should have asked you but haven't?
I think you're pretty thorough. I don't know. I think it's just all, to the extent that this is about the students, I think it's all about finding your bliss. It's all about finding an opportunity where you don't work. It's kind of like your hobby. And I hope that everybody out there watching this finds that, because it's very rewarding if you luck into that.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. This was delightful. Thank you so much, April.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.